not a lot, like you said, regarding like the gut training, but I was reading some of the studies, and then I know Alex Hutchinson had posted a few blog posts I was reading outside online about like just the gut training and stuff, and the popularity of like 100, 120 is like what athletes are trying. He's like, they're trying to eat as many carbs as possible now, basically, like during the race, and shove as many as you can in. So it's interesting, and I mean, gut training does seem to work. I personally like haven't done a lot of it because at this stage in my like running career, I haven't done anything exceeding even like a marathon. So it's like, you know, something to experiment with like longer distances. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely good evidence that I don't think that you can completely diminish. It almost seems like you're just tolerating a bit more GI, like less GI distress versus like you're going to eliminate GI distress with gut training. I mean, if you're trying to eat 100, 120 grams of carbs per hour, you're going to have some like gastrointestinal distress, I think. There was, I think, a study where they did, it was like an hour-long run, and they did 90, it was just 90 per hour, which is still a pretty decent amount, 90 per hour, and then they trained them for a month, and so they were still experiencing GI symptoms, but they weren't as severe. So I think, you know, perhaps longer training gut training study might have produced less GI symptoms, but I mean, at some point, I read somewhere they were like an ultra marathon. At some point, it just turns into like an eating competition. Like who can just like stomach the most and like fuel their body to do that. So, but it's interesting, and I think that I think eventually we'll begin to start seeing these formulations where they're going to mix carbohydrates with certain things to try to like either enhance their absorption or enhance their ability to, you know, maybe the body's ability to utilize carbohydrates to try to like fit them in, I guess. I mean, there's definitely have to be like some sort of limit to that, but it'll be interesting to see how kind of performance responds to it, because I think that there's an assumption that like more carbs is going to make you run faster, be able to go longer, but I definitely think there's a point where it's like either diminishing returns, you're eating too many carbohydrates and it's just going to lead to more GI distress, or like it's just, you know, is there a difference between 100 to 120? Can your body even absorb that many carbohydrates and use that many carbohydrates? And like you said, depending on the exercise intensity, I mean, unless you're maxing out, redlining, you know, you're not going to be using 100% carbohydrates. So if I'm eating 90 grams of carbs per hour, but I'm at 85%, but I'm still oxidizing a lot of fat, like, well, what's the point of shoving all these carbs in there? Do you even like need that? So, and you mentioned something a while ago that I've had this thought, or I've been thinking about this concept a lot. Like everybody always talks about the wall in like the marathon. You hit the wall because like, oh, our body has about, you know, 2200, 2400 stored kcal worth of glycogen. So marathon's 26 miles, you run 20 miles, you burn 100 kcals, then you bonk because you run out of glycogen. But it's like, that concept always seemed flawed to me. And based on what we know now, like it is flawed, because you and I have talked about this a lot, where you're never glycogen depleted.
Yeah, that's dead.
You never run out of all. You would be dead if you ran out of all your glycogen. So I think it's like 62%. Once you get down to about like 62% of your glycogen is kind of where your body's going to start to bonk, because it's like it's a preservation mechanism at that point. Like your brain needs, you know, the blood glucose, so your body's not going to let you dip below that. But even then, just the idea of hitting the wall never made sense, because even if you were using, I mean, you're not using 100% glycogen for that entire 20 miles. You're going to be using some fat depending on your level of fat oxidation or fat adaptation. So it just kind of never made sense. And I think you're just going back to like the gut training thing and how many carbs can you eat. It's a balance, and like doing equations, you know, you don't have to go as extreme maybe as you might in calculating I need this many grams per hour based on my fat ox rate. You know that data, so it's pretty cool. But you know, I mean, it'd be easy for people to see like at what intensity, what's the ratio that you're burning, and like you can do these calculations. But it's an interesting kind of movement, as you mentioned, maybe towards a pro-carbohydrate approach now.
Yeah, and where I think it gets really interesting is when you look at the different populations. So if you take, or where I think people kind of get confused is like if you take someone who's just a world-class endurance athlete, their work output at like their aerobic threshold is insane. Like if you look at, I think Lance Armstrong was just on Peter Attia's podcast. I don't know if you listened to that or not, but they were talking about like how much watts he was producing at his peak, and it's just an insane amount.
Wild, yeah.
So like when you think about like when you get to that degree where you got these athletes that are able to at a sustainable intensity produce outputs of like north of 1,000 calories an hour. And, you know, they're up to and beyond their aerobic threshold. And if we take a moderate high carb athlete, we're probably a 50-50 split around aerobic threshold. So like you can get scenarios where you might need 500-600 calories with a carbohydrate to sustain that activity for a significant amount of time once you start getting to that like 62% muscle glycogen point. So to some degree it is a math equation, but in order to run it properly, you kind of know your fat oxidation rates. So I always think that's like the next interesting piece of the puzzle is like, you know, maybe the value add for an endurance athlete is just go and get a metabolic cart test done and find out where that is. And if you don't change anything drastically with your diet, then you can probably safely assume what you're going to need. And if you extrapolate it out far enough, you can know like, well, if it's a short race, I don't really have to worry about glycogen depletion to a large degree. If it is, you know, an ultra marathon or something like that, maybe you do. And then it's just to what degree. Are you someone like myself who can get by on like 40 grams because of the high fat ox rates? Or are you like some of these guys? I'm actually having Hayden Hawks just won the Black Canyon 100K, which is one of the most competitive 100Ks in the world right now. And he released his inter-race fueling and hydration. There was some really interesting stuff in there. I think he was 109 grams of carbohydrate per hour. But the thing that actually really surprised me was he drank less than 500 milliliters of fluid per hour for 7.5 hours. So he was on the low end. It wasn't like super hot. It was pretty nice temperatures, I think, for running. But I thought that was pretty low, especially when you consider how much carbohydrate was taken in. Because like my understanding is the more carb you take in, the more fluid you probably need to go along with it. So I'm going to ask him about that if there was something that I missed in that data spreadsheet. But anyway, it was like, you know, he at the intensity he was running with, I assume he's on a high carbohydrate diet. I know he's been into like the gut training stuff. So I want to talk to him about that in terms of just like how he came up with that number, if that was just what ended up playing out on the day, or if he was specifically targeting that just north of 100 grams, and dig in because we have other ultra runners who are doing that now too. The most interesting one is maybe Kilian Jornet, who the reason he's more interesting to me is because he doesn't do gut training. He just goes with 100 grams though on race day. Wow. There was a breakdown of his fueling for what was it, UTMB, Ultra Trail Mont Blanc, and he was like 100 grams per hour for around 19 hours. So it's like that's where I start to get curious because I mean I could do no gut training and it could get away with 100 grams for an hour or for 2 hours without having any noticeable issues. But if I got to do that for 19 hours in a row, I'm gonna have to do some gut training if I want to do that.
Sure.
But he doesn't. I guess he actually kind of almost is like intentionally fuels very minimally in training and does these really long sessions with very little fuel.